Before I retired, I was Deputy National Intelligence Officer for the Near East in the National Intelligence Council, and I spent a total of 27 years in the CIA, working primarily as a media and political analyst. So I retired in 2010, and so I don't have sort of direct, the best information. But unfortunately, ISIS is one of these Salafist groups that is getting funded. We have some reporting coming in that they're funding the ISIS groups in Syria, and also that they are, as you know, they're bombing Yemen also. And so there is some evidence that they're funding them with weapons and sort of giving money to extremist groups there. Well, that's a very good question. I think that the U.S. bears certainly indirect responsibility for the proliferation of extremist groups like ISIS throughout the Middle East, because Saudi Arabia is a huge ally, and the United States needs to rein in this ally and really tell it quite firmly, stop, because we see what's happening with the bloodshed in Yemen. We have a refugee crisis here because of the Syrian conflict, and there's been recently a new leadership in Saudi Arabia. This is really a scandal because Saudi Arabia's behavior now has become unprecedented. Not only are they funding these extremist Salafist Islamic groups like ISIS, but also they are actively bombing Yemen. And of course, there's also a relationship between Israel and Saudi Arabia. They both have in common that they want to keep Iran in a box. Saudi Arabia and Iran have competed for a long time for preeminent influence in the Middle East. And so I now have hope that because the United States has signed an agreement, a nuclear agreement with Iran, I'm hoping that this will rein in Saudi Arabia. I understand that after the agreement was signed, that Saudi Arabia has now begun to have quiet talks with the Iranians. That's a stabilizing influence in the region, I believe, and I think it could result eventually in negotiations that could end the arms trafficking to ISIS and calm things down enough to maybe allow some of the refugees to return to Syria and to calm the situation. And also I should say that Russian President Vladimir Putin has a role in all of this as well, a stabilizing role in the Middle East. I think it's certainly an act of violence. It's a terrible act of violence and injustice against people. I have heard this. I had never heard this until this week when I visited Germany, and a lot of people have come up to me and said this. And my own opinion, based on my time in government, is that there is no deliberate plan, but that the refugee problem is simply a very tragic after effect of the neoconservative wars that are being prosecuted in countries like Syria. So my answer to the question is I think the refugee crisis is an unfortunate and tragic after effect of these wars that are being prosecuted in countries like Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, the drone wars in Pakistan and Somalia, refugees coming from everywhere right now, flooding Europe. It looks like a deliberate thing because they're all coming at once, but what it is it's the result of the arms dealers, the people who are making lots and lots of money out of these wars, and they are not thinking about the consequences of their actions. No one is thinking about the human cost of these wars, just that war is good for business and peace is bad for business. And I see that Germany is bearing the brunt of the flood of refugees, and I would suggest that perhaps since the U.S. has both direct and indirect roles in these wars, that they should welcome these refugees with open arms at Kennedy International Airport and other airports in the United States, just as they accepted the refugees after the wars in Vietnam, in Korea. We have many people from El Salvador. Everywhere where the U.S. has prosecuted wars, we have opened our doors to people who had nowhere to go. We now have a huge community of Iraqis living in Southern California. And if the United States wants to continue hosting refugees, well, then that's what all these wars are going to bring them. So I don't accept that this is, I don't accept the theory that this is deliberate, but I think it's a tragic consequence. So I think that there were groups already inside Syria, extremist groups, that took advantage of the Arab Spring of 2011, and I think then that was then exploited by other parties in the region, like Saudi Arabia, like Israel, like then the United States, that came in to try to unseat Assad. I don't think there was I think it started out innocently enough that there were Syrians that wanted to reform the things. You're talking about the project for the new American century that was drafted in 1996. Yes, Syria was on the list of countries that needed to go. It was Iraq, it was Syria, it was Libya, and that went down. It was Iran. So this was part of a neoconservative plan that was written, I believe, back in like 1996 or 1998. And at that time, the people who wrote this were kind of called by President Bush crazies, but this was by Bush Sr. He didn't want them in his cabinet, but when Bush Jr. came in, they became part of the cabinet, and their ideas and their plans came to the mainstream. Yes, and this plan was very, very close with the foreign policy of Israel that wanted to destabilize the Middle East. And I would say that the U.S. foreign policy and the Israeli foreign policy is almost the same, and I would say that because of the power that the American-Israeli Political Action Committee, the Israel lobby, has in our country. They have control of all of our congressmen, and therefore the interests of the United States is not really preeminent. It's subordinate to the interests of Israel. Okay, so unfortunately, because of the power of the Israeli lobby, U.S. interests are subordinated to the interests of Israel. And even if President Obama wanted to do something different, Israel controls all of Congress. You saw how Prime Minister Netanyahu came to the United States without being invited by President Obama and addressed the American Congress. So I think we have a problem in the United States as far as our foreign policy is concerned, and I believe that the neoconservatives that are running American policy have no right to do so because they are subverting national U.S. interests to the interests of Israel. One of my mistakes was maybe that I didn't speak out sooner about the things that I know. I think we all have fears when we're working in the government that, oh, you know, I don't want to lose my job because I have a mortgage to pay, etc., etc. But I think it would have been better if I had spoken out earlier about. I think that Germany needs to step up and speak out against the drone war. I think that Germans should not be afraid of saying no to the United States in terms of closing bases, in terms of maybe stepping away from policies that are illegal under international law, that are morally wrong, and that are reprehensible to Germans. I believe that Germany can also continue to be a loyal friend to the United States while saying no to certain things. Germans and Americans have a 70-plus year relationship. I think it's strong enough to weather these storms, and I keep hearing from Germans that this is like a taboo issue in Germany. So I would really like to see that. I think that the United States also needs to consider the consequences of its own.